Tick, tock. Tick, tock. What will run, but will not walk? Tick, tock. Tick, tock. What has a face, but cannot talk? Tick, tock. Tick, tock. What has hands, but fingers not? Tick, tock. Tick, tock. Tick, tock. Tick, tock. Did you guess it? Strange things happen when the clock strikes 12.
I liked your description of the people at the pension. I can see just the picture of the rather sinister Miss Cornelius with her toupee and clicking bangles. I don't wonder you felt frightened that night when you found her sleepwalking in the corridor, but, after all, why shouldn't she sleepwalk? As to the movements of the furniture in the lounge on Sunday, you are, I suppose, in an earthquake zone, though an earthquake seems too big an explanation for the ringing of that little handbell on the mantelpiece. It's rather as if our parlor maid, another new one, were to call a stray elephant to account for the teapot we found broke yesterday. You have at least escaped the eternal problems of the maids in Italy. Yes, my dear, I most certainly believe you. I have never had experiences quite like yours, but your mention of Miss Cornelius has reminded me of something rather similar that happened nearly 20 years ago, soon after I left school. I was staying with my aunt in Hampstead. You remember her, I expect, or, if not her, the poodle Monsieur that she used to make perform such pathetic tricks. There was another guest whom I had never met before, Mrs. Caleb. She lived in Lewis and had been staying with my aunt for about a fortnight, recuperating after a series of domestic upheavals, which had culminated in her two servants leaving her at an hour's notice, without any reason, according to Mrs. Caleb. But I wondered. I had never seen the maids. I had seen Mrs. Caleb, and frankly, I disliked her. She left the same sort of impression on me I gather your secretive Miss Cornelius leaves on you. Something queer and secretive, underground, if you can use the expression, rather than underhand. And I could feel in my body that she did not like me. It was summer. Joan Denton, you remember her husband was killed in Gallipoli, had suggested that I should go down and spend the day with her. Her people had rented a little cottage some 3 miles out of Lewis. We arranged a day. It was gloriously fine for a wonder, and I had planned to leave that stuffy old Hampstead house before the old ladies were astir. But Mrs. Caleb waylaid me in the hall, just as I was going out. "I wonder," she said, "I wonder if you could do me a small favor, if you do have any time to spare in Lewis, only if you do. Would you be so kind as to call at my house? I left a little traveling clock there in the hurry of the parting. If it's not in the drawing room, it will be in my bedroom or in one of the maids' bedrooms. I know I lent it to the cook, who was a poor riser, but I can't remember if she returned it. Would it be too much to ask? The house has been locked up for 12 days, but everything is in order. I have the keys here. The large one is for the garden gate. The small one is for the front door." I could only accept, and she proceeded to tell me how I could find Ashgrove House. "You will feel quite like a burglar," she said. "But mind, it's only if you have the time to spare. As a matter of fact, I found myself glad of any excuse to kill time. Poor old Joan had suddenly taken ill in the night. They feared appendicitis, and though her people were very kind and asked me to stay to lunch, I could see that I should only be in the way, and made Mrs. Caleb's commission an excuse for an early departure. I found Ash Grove without any difficulty. It was a medium-sized red brick house, standing by itself in a high-walled garden that bounded a narrow lane. A flag path led from the gate to the front door, in front of which grew not an ash but a monkey puzzle that must have made the room unnecessarily gloomy. The side door, as I expected, was locked. The dining room and drawing room lay on either side of the hall, and, as the windows of both were shuttered, I left the hall door open, and in the dim light looked around hurriedly for the clock, which, from what Mrs. Caleb had said, I hardly expected to find in either of the downstairs rooms. It was neither on the table nor the mantelpiece. The rest of the furniture was carefully covered with white dust sheets. Then I went upstairs, but before doing so, I closed the front door. I did in fact feel like a burglar, and I thought that if anyone did happen to see the front door open, I might have difficulty explaining things. Happily, the upstairs windows were not shuttered. I made a hurried search of the principal bedrooms. They had been left in apple pie order. Nothing was out of place, but there was no sign of Mrs. Caleb's clock. The impression the house gave me, the sense of personality that a house conveys, was neither pleasing nor displeasing, but it was stuffy. Stuffy from the absence of fresh air, with an additional stuffiness added, that seemed to come from the hangings and quilts and antimacassars. The corridor, onto which the bedrooms I had examined opened, communicated with a smaller wing, an older part of the house, I imagined, which contained a box room and the maid's sleeping quarters. The last door I unlocked, I should say that the doors of all the rooms were locked and relocked by me after I had glanced inside them, contained the object of my search. Mrs. Caleb's traveling clock was on the mantelpiece, ticking away merrily. That is how I thought of it at first. And then, for the first time, I realized that there was something wrong. The clock had no business to be ticking. The house had been shut up for 12 days. No one had come in to air it or to light fires. I remembered how Mrs. Caleb had told my aunt that if she left the keys with a neighbor, she was never sure who might get a hold of them. And yet the clock was going. I wondered if some vibration had set the mechanism in motion, and pulled out my watch to see the time. It was 1:05. The clock on the mantelpiece said 4 minutes to the hour. Then, without quite knowing why, I shut the door on the landing, locked myself in, and again looked around the room. Nothing was out of place. The only thing that might have called for remark was that there appeared to be a slight indentation on the pillow in the bed, but the mattress was a feather mattress, and you know how difficult it is to make them perfectly smooth. You won't need to be told that I gave a hurried glance under the bed. Do you remember your supposed burglars in number 6 at St. Ursula's? And then, and much more reluctantly, I opened the doors of 2 horribly capacious cupboards, both happily empty except for a framed text with its face to the wall. By this time I was really frightened. The clock went ticking on. I had a horrible feeling that an alarm might go off at any moment, and the thought of being in that empty house was almost too much for me. However, I made an attempt to pull myself together. It might, after all, be a 14-day clock. If it were, then it would be almost run down. I could roughly find out how long the clock had been going by winding it up. I hesitated to put the matter to a test, but the uncertainty was too much for me. I took it out of its case and began to wind. I had scarcely turned the winding screw twice when it stopped. The clock, clearly, was not running down. The hands had been set in motion probably only an hour or two before. I felt cold and faint. Going to the window, threw up the sash, letting in the sweet live air of the garden. I knew now that the house was queer, horribly queer. Could someone be living in the house? Was someone else in the house now? I thought that I had been in all the bedrooms, but had I? I had only just opened the bathroom door, and I certainly had not opened any of the cupboards except for those in the room which I was in. Then, as I stood by an open window, wondering what I should do next, and feeling that I just couldn't go down that corridor into the darkened hall to fumble the latch at the front door with what I don't know behind me, I heard a noise. It was very faint at first, and seemed to be coming from the stairs. It was a curious noise. Not the noise of anyone climbing up the stairs, but you will laugh if this letter reaches you by morning post, of something hopping up the stairs, like a very big bird would hop. I heard it on the landing. It stopped. Then there was a curious scratching noise against one of the bedroom doors. The sort of noise you can make with the nail of your finger scratching polished wood. Whatever it was coming slowly down the corridor, scratching at the doors as it went. I could stand it no longer. Nightmare pictures of locked doors opening filled my brain. I took up the clock, wrapped it in my mackintosh, and dropped it out of the window to a flower bed. Then I managed to crawl out to the window and, getting a grip on the sill, successfully negotiated, as the journalist would say, a 12-foot drop. So much for our abused gym at St. Ursula's. Picking up the mackintosh, I ran round the front of the door and locked it. Then I felt I could breathe. But not until I was on the far side of the gate did I feel safe. Then I remembered that the bedroom window was open. What was I to do? Wild horses wouldn't have dragged me into that house again unaccompanied. I made up my mind that I would go to the police station and tell them everything. I should be laughed at, of course, and they might easily refuse to believe my story of Miss Caleb's commission. I had actually begun to walk down the lane in the direction of town when I chanced to look back at the house. The window that I had left open was shut. No, my dear, I didn't see a face or anything dreadful like that, and of course it may have shut by itself. It was an ordinary sash window, and they're often difficult to keep open. And the rest? Why, there's really nothing more to tell. I didn't even see Miss Caleb again. She had some sort of fainting fit before lunchtime, my aunt informed me on my return, and had to go to bed. Next morning, I traveled down to Cornwall to join Mother and the children. I thought I had forgotten all about it, but when 3 years later, my Uncle Charles suggested giving me the traveling clock for a 21st birthday present, I was foolish enough to prefer an alternative that he offered. A collected edition of the works of Thomas Carlyle.